Thank you. Thank you very much for the lovely introduction. Welcome to King John and the making of Magna Carta. Here on our first slide, we have John reluctantly ratifying the Magna Carta. He's surrounded by his barons and senior clergymen, and they're all gathered at Runnymede Meadow, neutral ground between Windsor Castle and the lands of his barons. But on this image that dates from centuries after the Magna Carta, there's a small historical inaccuracy. Can anyone spot the historical inaccuracy? One of my favorite pastimes, spot the historical inaccuracy. Anyone? Yes. So yes, you are correct. King John is holding a quill, signing the Magna Carta in this image, when in fact he engrossed the Magna Carta with his seal, and the various engrossments of Magna Carta that were sent around England to the various castles and cathedrals and towns were all engrossed with the king's seal. So little thing like that, it may not seem particularly important, but it's indicative of how the Magna Carta passed into mythology, and all sorts of myths and legends grew up around King John and the Magna Carta. This is a part of history that's passed in to popular culture. And so the way we see King John and the way we see the Magna Carta today wasn't necessarily the way John and his barons saw the document in 1215, nearly 800 years ago. So what we're going to do over the past 45 minutes is look at how we see King John today, the sniveling villain of popular culture. We're going to look at the Magna Carta and how it's been seen as a touchstone for liberties, for law and justice and human rights. And then we're going to go back to 1215 and look at the barons' perspective, what they were trying to accomplish by imposing these terms on their king. And then we'll see how we got from 1215 to the present day and the rebirth of interest in the Magna Carta that occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries. So here is King John as we know him today, in numerous guises from film and theater. And with most villainous kings of England, there's two sides of the story. We look at Richard III, for instance. He's the hunchbacked villain of Shakespeare's play, but he's also received a very sympathetic treatment in some recent historical novels where he's been seen as misunderstood rather than monstrous. Whereas with John, portrayals of him have been remarkably consistent for centuries. He's not just seen as villainous, but he's seen as a sniveling, cowardly villain, which was not necessarily how he was viewed at the time, when he seemed a real threat to the prerogatives of his barons. But today we view him as this rather sniveling figure. I have one image there from Shakespeare's King John, which was performed at the Stratford Festival this past summer, and Shakespeare found some sympathetic aspects to John's reign. He liked that John stood up to the papacy, similar to how Henry VIII did in Tudor times. But Shakespeare also emphasized King John's culpability in the death of his nephew and rival for the throne, Arthur of Brittany, and this descent into paranoia that ultimately leads to the First Barons' War. And then in the 20th century, the various Robin Hood films all portrayed John as this sniveling villain. And that dates from the Errol Flynn film. We see at the bottom of the slide here, Claude Rains playing Prince John, announcing to his barons in a castle great hall that his brother King Richard's been captured on the way home from crusade, and that he is now going to rule the kingdom. And when the barons object, Prince John gets quite petulant and says, why should I not? Once again, not portraying himself as a strong ruler, but as this rather sniveling figure. And for many children, their first introduction to medieval English history, certainly my first introduction to medieval English history, is the Walt Disney Productions Robin Hood film from the 1970s, where Prince John is shown as a maneless lion who sucks his thumb and complains his mummy always loved Richard best. Now, that's actually accurate. Eleanor of Aquitaine did back her son Richard over John various circumstances. But once again, he's very easily brought to heel by Robin Hood and dismissed as a phony king of England. And the fact that his reputation is so unfortunate has even lent itself to satire. We see Richard Lewis there from the Mel Brooks film Robin Hood Men in Tights, where he plays Prince John there. And John's reputation is so bad it's satirized when Patrick Stewart, playing King Richard, comes home from crusade. He announces to a big crowd, brother, you've surrounded your name with a foul stench. Henceforth all toilets shall be known as John's, and the crowds cheer. And it's rare I get to quote Robin Hood Men in Tights in a lecture. It's exciting. So once again, reputation so unfortunate. It's lent itself to satire and even more serious portrayals of King Richard's reign and his brother John's reign. You see aspects of that sniveling personality. You see Paul Giamatti on the screen as well, who played John in the film Ironclad. The Russell Crowe Robin Hood film from 2010 once again tried to be more serious, but you still see John arguing with his mother and being indecisive, and generally not just being a villain, but being an ineffective villain. And this has created a very powerful received wisdom about what John was like. Now, in contrast to John, who's become known as the sniveling villain, and his reputation has become worse and worse over the centuries, the Magna Carta's reputation has become better and better as the centuries have passed. While at the time it was seen by King John's rebel barons as a means of ensuring that the king respected their traditional liberties, the Magna Carta came to inspire centuries of lawmakers and freedom fighters, and to inspire them to see this document as the foundation of human rights and individual liberties. Now, just as I have Mel Brooks and Shakespeare on the same slide previously, now I have Rudyard Kipling and Jay-Z on the same slide here discussing Magna Carta as the liberties enshrined by Magna Carta have been so inspirational. And the poet Rudyard Kipling summed this up in the poem What Say the Reeds at Runnymede, stating, at Runnymede, your rights were won at Runnymede. No freeman shall be fined or bound or dispossessed of freehold ground, except by lawful judgment found and passed upon him by his peers. Forget not, after all these years, the charter signed at Runnymede. And we also have an image here of the doors of the American Supreme Court that show John accepting the Magna Carta, and the cover art for the rapper Jay-Z's album Magna Carta Holy Grail, which was actually displayed at Salisbury Cathedral alongside one of the engrossments of the Magna Carta, showing how this document and how it symbolized freedom and democracy and individual rights have come to inspire writers and musicians and artists and lawgivers and politicians for centuries. So the present day, we have King John's reputation slipped into infamy, and the Magna Carta, as the centuries progressed, became a more and more significant document, transcending its times. But democracy and freedom and human rights for all were certainly not on the minds of the barons when they held King John to account in 1215. 13th century England was a very strictly hierarchical society, with a social hierarchy that seemed almost God-given. At the top of the secular hierarchy was the king, beneath him were his barons, and there were about 100 baronial families who might own dozens of manors and expected a direct say in how the kingdom was governed. They expected to sit on council and advise the king. Below the barons were the knights, who might have a single manor as opposed to dozens of them, and might have an annual income of £10 a year instead of hundreds of pounds a year. And landless knights could attach themselves to the household of a baron. So when the king went to war and called up his barons, the barons could bring their knights, and it served a social pyramid there. So we have about 100 baronial families, a few thousand knights, and below that, about 90% of the population were the peasantry, many of whom were tenant farmers or serfs who toiled on these baronial and knightly estates. And we're expected to contribute a certain amount of what they produced to these baronial estates, and a tithe as well to the church. And the church had its own social hierarchy with the pope at the top of that hierarchy, the cardinals, the Archbishop of Canterbury, being the senior archbishop in England, down to the bishops and the religious orders, the monks and nuns, all the way down to the parish priests. Now, these two hierarchies were supposed to have different jurisdictions. Render unto God what is God's, and unto Caesar what is Caesar's. But both John and his father, Henry II, found themselves in conflict with the church at various times, which undermine their reputations. And so the social hierarchy was very strictly ingrained. Marrying below your social class was known as disparagement, for instance. And there were a few groups who were outside this hierarchy. The urban merchants, for instance, often the towns had a certain degree of autonomy that enabled trade and the merchant class to operate independently of this system. But most people were tied to this social hierarchy. Now, with great power came great responsibility. There was no expectation that the king at the top of the social hierarchy would simply do as he liked. He was supposed to consult with his barons, who in turn were supposed to do what was in the interests of the knights, who in turn were expected to have a paternalistic care for the peasantry on their estates. The system didn't always work this way, but with great power was supposed to come great responsibility, where everyone knew their place in this broader social hierarchy. In this environment, democracy was associated with mob rule. Even ancient Athens or the Roman Republic, which had some degree of direct democracy, they feared a wider franchise would lead to mob rule and everyone having a say, rather than those who were most qualified to have a say. So democracy was actually viewed with suspicion in the Middle Ages and was not seen as the most desirable form of government the way it is today. It's interesting, with the social hierarchy being as it was, all the members of the nobility were expected to have some sort of working knowledge of the law. If you were a baron, you were advising the king and having your own local baronial courts. Knights were often called upon to sit on local juries and adjudicate local affairs. So even though formal legal education at Westminster dates from after the Magna Carta, dates from 1250, the entire upper class was expected to have some knowledge of the law and the customs of the realm, so that they could adjudicate disputes, and that would inform Magna Carta. Now, one of the things that ensured that successive monarchs after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, when William the Conqueror defeated the last Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, and started a new Norman dynasty on the English throne, one of the things that kept the kings to account and ensured that they upheld the laws and customs of the land was the fact that for successive generations there were rival claimants to the throne. We think of the line of succession as being fairly orderly from one generation to another, and from 1066 through to King John's time, that wasn't necessarily the case. There were often rival royal relatives who all were staking their claim to the throne. So in order to come out ahead, the member of the royal family who ultimately became king was literally campaigning for office in a military campaign sense, but also assuring the barons, the senior members of the clergy, that if they and their knights and their resources supported him, he would uphold these traditional laws and customs of the realm. So one example of this is the Charter of Liberties that was issued by William the Conqueror's youngest son, Henry I, in 1100, when he became King of England, coming out of a disputed succession. William the Conqueror had 3 surviving sons: Robert, who became Duke of Normandy; William II, who became King of England; and then the youngest son, Henry, who was left a large sum of silver. And he had been quite well educated educated. There was an expectation that he would go into the church, being a landless youngest son. Instead, after William the Conqueror died, Henry took great pleasure in playing his brothers off against each other, hoping that he would come out ahead. And instead, Robert and William figured out what was going on, and they passed a treaty saying that if they were childless, they would be each other's as heirs. Henry was not going to gain any lands through his scheming. So in 1100, while the eldest brother Robert was on crusade, William was hunting in the New Forest. Henry was there as well. William liked to keep his friends close and his enemies closer. He didn't want Henry off scheming somewhere. So Henry was there hunting with him. One of the members of the hunting party accidentally, so it was said, shot William II straight in the heart, and he died on the spot. Henry did not stop to apprehend whoever fired the bolt, and did not stop to ensure that his brother's body was gathered up, and instead rode to Winchester and seized the treasury and declared himself King of England. And that was immensely controversial. The church weighed in that aside from the rather suspicious circumstances surrounding William's hunting accident, there's the fact that Robert was on crusade, and depriving a crusader of his inheritance was considered a mortal sin. And so Henry had to make a case for why he should be king. He argued he'd been born in England after the conquest, and therefore was more naturally suited to become King of England. He'd been raised among English laws and customs. He also married Princess Edith of Scotland soon after he claimed the throne. She was descended from the old Saxon line. She'd also had a very intellectual education at Wilton Abbey, and she'd been seen wearing a nun's habit, and it was assumed that she was being trained to be an abbess. But that didn't stop Henry I. He visited the abbey, and either an elopement or a kidnapping ensued, but Edith became Henry I's queen. And once again, this left Henry with a problem with his reputation. He was depriving a crusader of his inheritance. There were whispers he'd been implicated in a fratricide, and now he was rumored to have kidnapped a nun. And so Henry needed to put forward that he was the ideal candidate. And so at his coronation at Westminster Abbey, he issued the Charter of Liberties, stating, "I, Henry, by the grace of God, having been crowned King of England, shall not take or sell any property from the church upon the death of a bishop or abbot until a successor has been named that church property. I shall end all the oppressive practices which have been an evil presence in England." So the first thing Henry did was reassure the church, and that would be the opening of Magna Carta as well, that freedom would be granted to the English church. So the precedent dates all the way back to 1100, and so that the church that was very suspicious of how Henry had come to the throne and his marriage, he was quick to reassure them. And then he moves on to the barons. "If any baron or earl of mine shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom." Henry's brother and his father had filled shortfalls in the treasury by making barons who newly succeeded to their father's lands purchase their inheritance. Henry was going to abolish that. There is autonomy for noble widows here as well. "Any wife of my barons who becomes a widow shall not be denied her dowry. She should be allowed to remarry according to her wishes." And Clause 8 referred to the rule of the law. "If any of my barons commit a crime, he shall not bind himself to the crown with a payment, as was done in the time of my father and brother, but shall stand for the crime as was the custom and law before the time of my father, and shall make amends as are appropriate. Anyone guilty of treachery or other heinous crimes shall make proper amends." So Henry I, this is King John's great-grandfather, is laying down from his coronation day how he is going to rule England, and pacifying all the major groups of supporters he needs, the church, the barons, and promising that despite those shady circumstances that brought him to the throne, this was going to be an England ruled by the rule of law. Of course, this Charter of Liberties was not the only guarantee that Henry sought for acceptance of his rule. He ordered the various barons to send their children to court, and if the barons remained loyal, their children would be educated with the heir to the throne, and would have there'd be knighthoods for the boys, good marriages for the girls, excellent networking opportunities, we would say today. But if these barons disobeyed, their children might be blinded or killed. fulfilled. So Henry I found he had the most compliant nobility in all of Europe, that all of the nobles assembled when they were needed for his wars, and otherwise obeyed all his dictates. So some of the barons may have been terrified, but for ordinary English people, it seemed as though Henry I's reign from 1100 to 1135 was this period of peace. And it might have remained a period of peace if Henry I had a clear heir to succeed him. Henry I and his wife Edith of Scotland had a daughter Matilda and a son William Adelin. Henry I also had around 25 children outside of wedlock. He actually holds the record for English kings in terms of most number of children acknowledged from his various relationships, and they all received castles and were married to heirs and heiresses. So in the next reign, it would turn out that Henry I had fathered his own political faction, so they would turn out to be very significant in the next reign. But there was only one legitimate son, William Adelin, and one chronicler described him as a prince so pampered he seemed destined to be food for the fire, that William Adelin clearly had a rather spoiled upbringing. But he also seemed to lack his father's ruthlessness. He took it for granted everyone liked him, all of these noble children he'd been raised with, all of these half-brothers and sisters. He'd had a very sociable upbringing, so it seemed as though when he came to the throne, the peace established by his father would continue, but without the ruthlessness, as there wasn't a clear alternate claimant to the throne. But when William Adelin was only 17 in 1120, all of Henry I's plans came to an end. Henry I and his son William were in Barfleur, Normandy, where Henry was presiding over new knighthoods, and the king and his heir never sailed on the same ship on the same tide. Even crossing the English Channel could be very dangerous. So Henry I left on a morning ship with instructions that his son was to follow on another ship in the afternoon. But the 17-year-old prince found he had the castle to himself with a full wine cellar, and instead he threw a big party and invited all the teenage lords and ladies who'd all been there for the knighthoods, and the 20-something lords and ladies were all invited to the castle for a really big send-off party for the heir to the throne. The drinking and the dancing went all day and into the night, so it was dark by the time William Adelin and about 300 inebriated nobles and their staff all piled onto this ship. He was encouraging as many people to come to England as possible. The party would continue there, and they brought the ale with them. William Adelin reputedly gave ale to all the crew members as well, and they all cheered that he was a just and merciful prince. And then as the ship left in the darkness, another ship was spotted up ahead, and they decided to race. And William Adelin's ship hit a rock in the darkness and went to the bottom of the English Channel, and only a few of the servants were found clinging to the wreckage the next day. The heir to the throne and the flower of the nobility had all gone to the bottom of the English Channel. And this seems strangely modern in some ways. We think of medieval deaths as involving plague and pestilence and sword fighting, but Henry I lost his teenage son in a drinking and boating accident. So it seems so drinking and boating was a bad idea then. It still is now. So sometimes there's practical lessons from history, and there's one of them. And so as well as being a great personal tragedy for Henry I, we see for a king who had very little use for the church early in his reign, suddenly after his son's death, he's founding abbeys as though he thought some of his actions early in his reign were coming back to haunt him. And at that time, as well as being this personal tragedy, it was also a tragedy for the kingdom. And one of the chroniclers of the time said no ship ever brought such misfortune to England. For it became unclear who was going to succeed Henry I. He ordered his barons to all swear allegiance to his daughter Matilda, and his barons were used to doing exactly what Henry I said, and so they did. And so they all swore allegiance to Matilda, to King John's grandmother. But there was behind the scenes a lot of questioning about how would this work, that Female succession had not been attempted in England before. A king's prime duty was to lead the troops into battle. How was that going to work? Matilda was the widow of the German Holy Roman Emperor. She always described herself as Empress Matilda, being a higher title than queen. But her second husband was Geoffrey, the Count of Anjou. Anjou being one of the small counties that bordered Normandy. And the English barons wondered, were they all going to have to take orders from her husband? No one liked him very much. Matilda didn't like him very much. He tried to return to her father's court, and Henry I ordered her back to Geoffrey because he wanted grandchildren to leave the throne to. So it became uncertain exactly whether Matilda would be able to get the support that she needed. And a few years before Henry I's death in 1135, Matilda gave birth to a son, the future Henry II, John's father. And Henry I may have hoped he'd live long enough that he could simply pass the throne to his grandson, and there would be no controversy. And instead, Henry I died after an overindulgence of lamprey eels in 1135. That's one of the more distinctive medieval deaths. And Matilda was pregnant and in Anjou at the time, and her previous pregnancy had almost killed her. She was unable to simply get on a horse and get to the nearest harbor and get to England. And so her cousin Stephen, Henry I's sister Adela's son Stephen, happened to be the closest royal relative to Westminster Abbey, and he wasn't even Henry I's sister's eldest son, but he arrived and proclaimed himself king. And his situation was even more tenuous than Henry I. I mean, at least Henry I had been a son of William the Conqueror. Very few people had heard of the new King Stephen, and so he expanded the Charter of Liberties established by Henry I. There was going to be more autonomy for the barons, more autonomy for the church. He was in a position where he had to grant concessions to ensure that he could gain the power base necessary. But unfortunately for Stephen, he managed to alienate all Henry I's children from his various relationships, who decided they were better off with supporting their half-sister Matilda than their cousin Stephen. Matilda's uncle was also King of Scotland and was always glad to invade, as long as there was some territory there for him. And so Stephen found himself locked in a civil war with Matilda. Her husband Geoffrey invaded Normandy. Her half-brother, the Earl of Gloucester, invaded England. And so decades passed of Stephen's forces and Matilda's forces in a kind of stalemate, and this became known as the Anarchy, or When Christ and His Saints Slept, as this civil war gripped England in the mid 1100s for most of Stephen's reign. And the chroniclers of the time were infuriated with both Stephen and Matilda. And it's fascinating. Matilda is often described as too arrogant, too mannish for a woman of her time, whereas Stephen's described as too easygoing, too effeminate. So neither of them were matching the gender expectations of their time. Neither of them were the sort of ruler that England needed at that time. They managed to take each other prisoner at various times, but the war dragged on. And as soon as Matilda's son Henry, at 14, was old enough to fight, or at least he thought he was old enough to fight, his first campaign at the age of 14 didn't last long. He wasn't able to pay his men and had to retreat. But as soon as the future Henry II was able to participate in the hostilities, he sailed for England to participate. And he didn't describe himself as the Count of Anjou, but as Henry Fitz Empress. He was coming to claim his mother's throne. And this war ultimately ended when Stephen, trapped in this stalemate, agreed to acknowledge the future Henry II as his heir. That Stephen's older son had died in the midst of the fighting, and the younger son didn't want to spend the rest of his life fighting Henry Fitz Empress. He would be content to be the richest baron in the kingdom if he could be appropriately paid off. So Stephen and the future Henry II came to an accord. Stephen would treat Matilda's son as his own son, and so King John's father would come to the throne as Henry II. And what enabled what enabled Henry to force this agreement, as Stephen certainly for the longest time wanted his own family to succeed to the throne, was his very advantageous marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was the wealthiest heiress in Europe at that time. See the map there. How little of France was actually controlled by the King of France. The green part is the part of France controlled by the King of France and his immediate vassals. The Count of Champagne, for instance, was also one of the King of France's vassals. That sort of the dark red in the middle is Anjou and Maine and Touraine. Normandy's just north of that. And then there's the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, the light pink to the south. And Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage from a very young age was very significant, for whoever married her would control much of what is southwestern France. And her father, the Duke of Aquitaine, had left her guardianship to King Louis VI of France, Louis the Fat, as he was known, with instructions to find a husband for Eleanor. And he did find a husband, his own son, the future Louis VII, with the intention that Aquitaine was going to be bound to France. Now, the marriage did not go particularly well. Louis VII and Eleanor appear to have been personally incompatible. Louis had been raised in a monastery as the second son. He was quite happy there until his brother died, and he was expected to lead court entertainments and marry Eleanor. They had gone on crusade together. That had been a disaster, and they had no sons, which ultimately led to the annulment of their marriage. And while this annulment was coming together, the 19-year-old future Henry II visited the French court, and he and 30-year-old Eleanor appear to have come to an understanding as to what that they would marry as soon as her marriage was annulled. And of course, neither of them mentioned that to the King of France, who would have been much less likely to agree to this annulment if he knew what Eleanor's next move would be. So the annulment happened. Eleanor promised she would not remarry without the King of France's permission, and a few weeks later she married Henry. And so for 19-year-old Henry, he now controlled most of what is now Western France, Normandy, Anjou, the Duchy of Aquitaine, and he'd stolen the King of France's ex-wife, which made this even more exciting. And so Henry, with those resources from Aquitaine, Normandy, Anjou, was able to impose that settlement on Stephen. And so in 1154, when he became king, he becomes king not just of England, but of this vast Angevin empire. And it would be John's loss of this empire that would be the trigger for Magna Carta. And it's important to keep in mind. We often think of Magna Carta in a very English context, but a number of John's barons had estates on the continent as well as estates in England. And this empire being held together in a cohesive manner was absolutely essential. Now, Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had 8 children. She'd had two daughters from her first marriage to the King of France, and then 8 children with Henry II. Unfortunately, we don't get realistic portraiture until the reign of Henry VIII. So this illuminated manuscript image that I have on the slide, everyone looks about the same. Even the first son, who died in infancy, is portrayed as an adult. And yeah, we see the 3 daughters have their heads covered, showing they were married women, and 2 of those daughters have crowns on, so they'd married kings. So we have an idea of everyone's status, but the various brothers don't look particularly different. So unfortunately, with the portraiture of the period, we don't get a good sense of how everyone looked. We do know from the accounts of chroniclers that John was red-headed, that he was shorter than his brother Richard, was quite stocky, and had a love of fine clothing and fine jewels. And he bathed once every 3 weeks at a time when bathing was considered a rare luxury, even for the rich. The monastic orders called for monks to bathe between 2 and 4 times a year. So the fact that John grew up to be someone who bathed every 3 weeks made the chronicles of the time, the way we might note a political figure who was showering 3 or 4 times a day, that was considered unusual for his times. Now, John was born in 1166, and Eleanor was around 45 at the time. So he was very probably a late surprise to his family, who had already made plans for the 3 surviving older brothers. The young Henry was going to inherit his father's lands, England, Anjou, Normandy. The second son, Richard, was going to inherit his mother's lands, the Duchy of Aquitaine. The third son, Geoffrey, was going to be married to the heiress to Brittany and inherit that that region of northwestern France. And so John from a very young age became known as John Lackland, because there didn't seem to be any land for this fourth son. So he spent his early years at Fontevraud Abbey. I have the image there on the slide. This is the part of the talk where you get subjected to my travel photos. I was there in 2010, and Fontevraud Abbey had a particularly close relationship with the royal family. Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and their son Richard would all be buried there. And so John had his early education there, so he was much better educated than many princes of the time whose educations focused on sword fighting. That in John's case, as an adult, he traveled with a traveling library of books. So this early church education seems to have had an impact on him. But at some point during John's childhood, the plans for him changed. And his father, Henry II, who ended up on the outs with his older sons, became quite close to John and wanted to ensure that there be some lands provided for his youngest son. And so he tried to take castles away from the inheritances of his older sons to put together some kind of package of lands for John, and that led to open war with his elder sons. His teenage sons, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, all declared war on their father, and Eleanor backed her sons over her husband. The marriage wasn't going so well by that point due to Henry II's womanizing, but it also wasn't going well because Henry II thought he ran a centralized empire, that he ran entirely himself, whereas Eleanor saw herself as the sovereign Duchess of Aquitaine, who should be able to rule her own duchy, and the sons thought that they too should be treated as regional magnates and be able to govern their future lands themselves, with Henry II acting as a sort of overlord over all these interests. And so father and sons ended up at war in 1173, 1174, and Henry was forced to come to terms with his sons, and it became clear there'd be no lands for John there. John spent a period in his late teens as Lord of Ireland. Henry II thought that might be a place for him. He didn't. He made a rather poor showing there as Lord of Ireland. He insulted the local chieftains. Apparently tugged on their beards. Him and his various fellow teenage lordlings managed to make a very poor impression. And so he developed a reputation for rather poor leadership skills from a very young age. And that lasted into the next reign. At the time that Henry II died in 1189, his son, the young Henry, died of dysentery. His third son, Geoffrey, had died falling off his horse in a tournament. And so there were only two surviving sons, Richard and John. And it was Richard who succeeded to both his mother's and his father's lands, inheriting the entire Angevin Empire. Now this left John the only adult member of the royal family, and Richard and John made a public show of unity. Richard showered his brother John with lands in Normandy and England. He's made the Count of Mortain. He was married to Isabel, the Countess of Gloucester. Her sisters were conveniently disinherited, so she would receive all the lands, an example of the crown interfering in the inheritance of the barons. But Richard left his brother no political authority. The widowed Eleanor of Aquitaine had far more influence over Richard's reign than John did, and Richard apparently dismissively said of his 23-year-old brother that John would not be able to seize a kingdom if there was a single person able to give resistance. So Richard just had a very contemptuous attitude towards John, and that had been fueled by John's actions during Henry II's last days, when it became clear Richard was going to succeed to everything. John had defected from his father's camp to his brother's camp, was very eager to make nice with Richard and ensure that he was on the right side. And so he had a reputation for treachery. After all those years of his father trying to provide for him, he deserted Henry II during his last days in order to be the first one there to swear fealty to Richard. So John was left with no authority, and this when Richard went on the Third Crusade, and this reputation for treachery, and he wasn't even made heir to the throne before he'd fallen off that horse in a tournament, Geoffrey and his wife Constance had a son, Arthur, who was a toddler at the time of the crusade, and Richard thought it was safer to declare that Arthur was his heir rather than John, an adult alternate ruler. So with Richard away on crusade, John colluded with the King of France, as Philip II, the son of Louis VII, and of course France wanted to expand into the Angevin Empire. John wanted to get his hands on some of Richard's lands and at least be affirmed as heir to the throne. And so this is where the origins of John's reputation from the Robin Hood legends came from, is all the trouble he was causing in England and in the Angevin Empire while Richard was on crusade. And ultimately, Richard was captured by the Holy Roman Emperor, the German Emperor, on his way home from crusade, who set a huge ransom. And this was very advantageous to the emperor, because on the one hand, Eleanor of Aquitaine was taxing England, trying to gather this huge ransom, and then there was John and the King of France trying to offer a counterbid for Richard to be kept imprisoned by the German Emperor. So for the Holy Roman Emperor, this was perfect. He had a bidding war to let Richard out or keep Richard in, depending on whether he was talking to Eleanor or to John and Philip. But Richard was ultimately ransomed and made it home, and he made peace with his brother John in a very patronizing way, saying to his brother, who's now in his late 20s, that you're a child who's been led astray by false friends, and forgave his brother in a very patronizing way. But for the rest of Richard's reign, John remained loyal to his brother, knowing with Richard at home there was no way that he could rebel. Richard was a superior soldier in every way, and he hoped that he would be acclaimed heir to the throne, and that seems to have been the case in 1199, when Richard died of gangrene following an infected crossbow wound, and John succeeded to the throne, and Richard accepted this. Arthur was still a young teenager, and an adult male was needed to lead the troops into battle. And Eleanor of Aquitaine favored the claim of her son over her grandson, who'd grown up in Brittany, and she barely knew him. But Arthur was still an alternate claimant to the throne. So John was in a position where, like his predecessors, he had to fight for his inheritance. And despite his reputation for poor leadership and military mismanagement, he managed to make a good showing to the beginning of his reign. England and Normandy proclaimed John, but Anjou proclaimed Arthur, and Aquitaine, still being ruled by the elderly Eleanor, backed John, and so Arthur went to besiege his grandmother in Aquitaine in his mid-teens. That's the House of Plantagenet, and they're always at war with each other. And John managed to relieve the siege, got Arthur into custody, rescued his mother. Of course, the BBC series The Devil's Crown, influenced by the Robin Hood legends, imagines John arriving saying, "Did I do well, mother? Did I do better than Richard?" So you see the influence of I simply assume that John would have been living in Richard's shadow even as king. But having apprehended Arthur, become king, it seemed as though John's reign was off to a very good start, and that he was going to be able to stabilize the Angevin Empire. Unfortunately, John squandered all that goodwill that he'd managed to acquire by quickly and decisively uniting the empire by the disappearance of his nephew Arthur. The barons assumed that John would come to terms with his nephew, as Richard had come to terms with John, and Henry II had come to terms with his sons. There'd be some sort of an agreement that would enable Arthur to go on ruling Brittany and receiving some sort of lands. And to the barons, this would be the ideal arrangement. There's an alternate claimant. If John refused to uphold the laws and the customs of the land, the barons could threaten to defect to Arthur. So having an alternate claimant around was always in the interest of the nobility. And instead, the teenaged Arthur disappeared in John's custody. He'd been placed under the guardianship of the Earl of Bramber, William de Braose. But the chroniclers recorded rumors that John himself had murdered Arthur, having had too much to drink and possessed by the devil, fueled by a rage, that he'd strangled the young man himself and thrown the body in the river. If you thought Richard III had a bad reputation, no one accuses Richard III of actually personally killing the princes in the Tower. He's been accused of ordering it, whereas the chroniclers point the finger straight at John, that it wasn't in the interest of any of the barons to get rid of Arthur, but it was in John's interests. And the disappearance of Arthur cast a shadow over John's reign. He'd gone too far, according to the strictures of the time, and he created an international incident. Brittany wanted to know where their ruler was. He'd just been apprehended by John and disappeared. And over the course of John's reign, he fell out with a number of key groups in society that he needed to prop up his reign. He got into an argument with the papacy over who was going to be made the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope's candidate was Stephen Langton, who went on to author the Magna Carta. And John was against this. He thought Langton had far too many connections with Philip II's court in France. So he objected to this and found himself in a conflict with the papacy, and this escalated. Like, once again, conflicts with the papacy were nothing new. Henry II had been implicated in the death of another Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, but John's unwillingness to compromise or even make any sort of show of penance for this conflict he was in led to England being placed under interdict. Religious services ended throughout much of John's reign, and John himself was excommunicated, kicked out of the Roman Catholic Church. So he managed to burn his bridges with the church, and John treated this as a papal declaration of war. He had no hesitation about confiscating assets from abbeys, for instance, considering the conflict he was in with the church. He also found himself in conflict with the barons as his financial needs, the constant wars with his former ally Philip II of France over the continental empire, led to him needing more and more funds for the military campaigns. So he came to interfere with the barons succeeding to their lands. Those old inheritance taxes were imposed once more, and he developed a reputation for arbitrary dealing. An example would be the fate of William de Braose and his wife Maud. William de Braose had been one of John's favorites. He'd been given the custody of Arthur of Brittany, which showed how much John trusted him. But by later in John's reign, William owed a fair sum of money to the crown, and so John decided, without any due process, that William should have to hand over his son as a hostage until that money was paid. And William's wife Maud rather indiscreetly commented that she'd not give her son to a man who'd murdered his own nephew, and she was in a position to know, seeing as her husband had Arthur's custody. John was enraged. He confiscated all the Braose lands. The family fled to Ireland, where Maud and her son were captured. Maud came up with promises of larger and larger amounts of money that she would give the crown to allow her release and the return of her family's lands, sums of money that were higher than Richard the Lionheart's ransom before John allowed her to attempt to raise the money. And of course she could not, and Maud and her son were imprisoned in a castle dungeon and starved to death. And to the other barons, seeing this happen, it seemed as though this could be any of them. If a king could utterly destroy a noble family over an unpaid debt and some indiscreet remarks, not over treason or treachery or anything else like that, everyone was at risk, and that John would have to be called to account. And it's interesting that all of John's political and personal failings might have been forgiven if he'd managed to hold the empire together, the vast Angevin Empire. But Philip II had won military victory after another, and John lived up to his childhood nickname of John Lackland. And at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, he lost most of the Angevin Empire. He lost Normandy and Anjou, and parts of Aquitaine were invaded from the south by the Castilian royal family. So he was losing this vast empire, and with the disappearance of Arthur of Brittany, there wasn't a clear alternate claimant who could be backed. To previous reigns, if someone had reigned like this, the barons would have all simply shifted their allegiance to the nearest relative, but there wasn't a clear alternate claimant, and so the barons came up with a new plan, the making of Magna Carta, a great charter that would bind the king to those traditional laws and customs that had been upheld by Henry I, by Stephen, by Henry II, who'd emphasized the continuity with his grandfather, Henry I. And although the intention of the charter was to bind the king to traditional liberties, traditional laws, this was a revolutionary document in the sense that the king was having terms imposed by his subjects. subjects. The previous monarchs had made all sorts of promises themselves that may have been influenced by the political circumstances they were in, but they were not formally imposed to the degree that John faced. And John had no had no opportunity to do anything but agree to the barons' terms in 1215. A key faction of barons who became known as the Northerners. They're based out of East Anglia. In fact, threw off their oaths of fealty to John. Their supporters seized the city of London, and John was in a situation where his military campaigns against France could not go on without enough barons and knights contributing to these. He was having to hire foreign mercenaries. Many of them were French, so they weren't particularly reliable in a war against France. So John was backed into a corner and was compelled to accept this charter. Now there are numerous clauses, some of which have withstood the test of time, and other of which are lists of various corrupt officials who needed to be fired as soon as possible, and very much reflect the concerns of the time. I have some of the key clauses up on the slide, though there's certainly a lot more in this document as well. As with the Charter of Liberties passed by Henry I, the Magna Carta began with, "In the first place, we grant to God and confirm by this our present charter for ourselves and our heirs in perpetuity that the English Church is to be free and to have all its rights fully and its liberties entirely." And that's actually one of the clauses that is still on the statute books in the United Kingdom today, the freedom for the English Church. And then, as Henry I did, John moved on to pacify the barons, stating, "If any of our earls and barons, or anyone holding from us in chief by military service should die, and should his heir be of full age and owe relief, the heir is to have his inheritance for the ancient relief, namely the heir or heirs of an earl for a whole county, 100 pounds, the heir or heirs of a baron for a whole barony, 100 marks, and the heir or heirs of a knight for a whole knight's fee, 100 shillings at most, and he who owes less will give less, according to the ancient custom of knights' fees." So no more instances of the king simply coming up with whatever sum of money he needed for his next military campaign and ordering that various baronial heirs pay that. There was going to be a set system of inheritance that recognized the crown was having financial issues and the Angevin Empire was falling apart. But there was going to be due process and a set series of rules for how lands would be passed. "No widow shall be distrained to marry for as long as she wishes to live without a husband, provided that she give surety that she will not marry without her assent, if she holds from us, or without the assent of her lord, if she holds of another." And although there were no women directly present supporting the Magna Carta, this sets a key precedent in terms of freedom from forced marriage in centuries to come. As we saw before, Henry I had also upheld that noble widows had the right to remain unmarried, and many did. Being a widow, you had the most autonomy you could have as a woman in 13th century society, especially if you were a childless widow. You didn't have either your father, your husband, or your adult sons ordering you around. So many chose to remain widows, and Richard and John had interfered with that. Richard needed to raise money for his crusade, and one of the ways in which he did so was by selling off the wardships to the various noble widows and orphan noblewomen in his care to whoever donated the most to the crusade. And sometimes those were excited urban merchants who were getting to marry into the nobility. Normally, even the poorest knight's daughter would not consider the wealthiest merchant because it was considered a lower social class. But for a big enough donation to Richard's crusade, these marriages known as disparagements could take place. If you ever read Edward Rutherford's novel London, it dramatizes how one of these women may have felt, who'd always had this confidence that she was a lady, and now there's a thrilled merchant coming along who's donated to the crusade, and now he gets to marry her, and she can't believe this is happening to her, and that the king would allow it, as that goes against his position as her guardian and her liege lord. John as well needed money for his continental campaigns, and also he wanted to reward his supporters, especially as the number of supporters he had started to trickle off later in his reign. Those who stayed, but might simply be awarded the right to marry a noble widow, and if she protested, her dower lands might be confiscated, so she could find herself unable to support herself economically. So once again, there's a recognition of of the crown's interests, in that the widow has to ask permission to remarry, so she's not marrying John's worst enemy, but at the same time, he cannot compel her to marry. The most famous clause in all of Magna Carta, the one that's really resounded through the ages, though, is no free man is to be taken or imprisoned, deceased of his free tenement or his liberties or free customs, or outlawed or exiled or in any way ruined, nor will we go against such a man or send against him save by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell or deny or delay the right of justice. So this is the clause that has transcended its own time, and the reference to free men, the number of free men was smaller in 1215, but with the breakdown of the feudal system in subsequent centuries, this clause will come to apply to more and more of the English population until it applies to everyone. And it was offering due process. What had happened to the Braose family was supposed to never happen again, and also freedom from arbitrary rule, jury by peers. And this is the clause that would inspire future scholars and lawmakers to revive Magna Carta as a foundational document. So significant as this all seems to us, the king and his barons thought it was unlikely that this would last more than a few weeks. The king was not going to agree to constraints on his power. This was King John. He'd never agreed to constraints on his power. And the barons were trying something new, imposing terms on the king, and it also seemed unlikely that would succeed in the long term. So within some weeks of having placed his seal on Magna Carta, copies of Magna Carta have been distributed throughout the land. John made peace with the papacy, finally, so that he could be released from his oath to uphold the terms of Magna Carta. And the barons didn't try this experiment again at that time. They decided to go by the old tried and true method of find an alternate claimant. So they went to Philip II's son, the future Louis VIII of France. He was married to John's niece, and so had some sort of a claim to the throne, and invited him to invade England. And the barons have been criticized for this, for inviting a French invasion. But we've seen how much of modern-day France was controlled by England. Those national boundaries, English, French, were not as firm as they would be centuries later. King John's court spoke French as the court language. There were a lot of cultural similarities. And so in this environment, the heir to the French throne might be seen as a regional power broker and the only one with an army big enough to deal with John, rather than as a foreign ruler. And so Louis invaded England, and he was acclaimed as a liberator. He was proclaimed king at St. Paul's Cathedral. John had to retreat. In his retreat, he managed to lose the crown jewels crossing a marsh, so really unfortunate. So not only is he having to leave, not only is he having to retreat out of London away from Winchester, he loses the crown jewels, and it seemed as though it was a matter of time before Louis's coronation was going to take place, and England and France might ultimately be united. But John managed to save England's independence by dying in 1216 of dysentery following a surfeit of peaches and cider. Though he was so unpopular by that time, there was speculation he'd been poisoned that circulated, and that changed the political equation entirely, as John's heir was his 9-year-old son, Henry II, the son of John, and his second wife is Isabel of Angoulême. And Magna Carta explicitly forbade preventing underage heirs from taking their inheritance. If the barons were to continue to back Louis in these situations, they'd be going against Magna Carta. And a long regency for an underage king provided an opportunity for a council of barons to continue the process of reform that had begun with Magna Carta, and hope that Henry III would go along with it once he came of age. But there would be many, many years to iron out any inconsistencies that were in the original charter, expand on the clauses. So Louis, at the moment where he thought he was going to be crowned, suddenly loses all his support. The barons switch sides to Henry III under the guardianship of William Marshal, and Louis was essentially paid to go back to France and renounce his claims to the English throne. He's no longer needed here, back to France. And Henry III was crowned king with one of his mother's circlets, as the crown jewels had been lost, and his head would have been too small for the larger crown anyway. And with the end of this First Barons' War, the first order of business was to expand on Magna Carta, and the Charter of the Forest addressed the forest laws, that were the evil customs relating to forest law mentioned in Magna Carta. About a third of the land in England in John's time was forest, and was deemed to be forest land. Not all of this was forest as we would think of it. Some of this were pastures and villages, and with an expanding population, this is the medieval warm period, everyone from the barons to the peasantry wanted to be able to expand their land. But for the king, the forest was a source of revenue. You could charge people for digging ditches or pasturing their livestock, and ordinary people from all social estates wanted a break from that. So the Charter of the Forest stated, "No one shall henceforth lose life or limb because of our venison, but if anyone's been arrested and convicted of taking venison, he shall be fined heavily if he has the means. If he has not the means, he shall lie in our prison for a year and a day, and if after a year and a day he can find pledges, he may leave prison, but if not, he shall abjure the realm of England." So previously, if you were caught poaching the king's deer, you could lose life and limb. And the Charter of the Forest acknowledged that still only the king had the right to hunt deer, but there would be fines instead of losing body parts, so this was an improvement. And then the most significant aspect of this, every free man may henceforth, without being prosecuted, make in his wood or his land a forest, a mill, a preserve, a pond, a marl pit, a ditch, or an arable outside the closed thicket and arable land, on condition it doesn't harm any neighbor. So management of common resources therefore moves from the king's arbitrary rule to the common good, on the condition it does not harm any neighbor. The people are now accountable to their neighbors rather than to the king about common stewardship of shared resources. And when Henry III came of age, in exchange for some new taxes, he agreed to accept both Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. Now, after the reigns of John, his son Henry III, and Henry III's son Edward I, Magna Carta went through a period of comparative obscurity, but it was reborn in the 17th century by the jurist Sir Edward Coke during the reign of James I, who thought that the true significance of Magna Carta was that it made the king accountable to the law. Magna Carta is such a fellow that he shall have no sovereign. And Coke helped author the Petition of Right that held Charles I to account prior to the English Civil Wars, which stated that no man hereafter shall be compelled to make or yield any gift or loan or benevolence or tax or such like charge without common consent by act of Parliament, and none shall be called to make answer or take such an oath or give attendance or be confined or otherwise molested or disquieted concerning the same or for refusal thereof, and that no free man in such a manner as before mentioned be imprisoned or detained. So we see these rights that applied to the barons. Now it's no free man. That they apply to all. And Charles I did not ultimately uphold the Petition of Right, and the English Civil Wars broke out. But the existence of this petition follows that pattern set by Magna Carta of the king's subjects calling him to account. Now, Sir Edward Coke's interpretation of Magna Carta as the most significant document in English legal history spread throughout the English-speaking world because he was the one writing the law textbooks. He wrote the Institute of Laws that was studied in the 13 colonies by Thomas Jefferson, who wrote to James Madison, "A sounder Whig never wrote, nor of profounder learning in the orthodox doctrines of the British Constitution, or what were called English liberties." So the drafters of the Declaration of Independence are thinking of Magna Carta as Coke did. The other regions of the English-speaking world, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, are all inheriting this legal tradition that was Coke's commentaries on the Magna Carta. So Sir Edward Coke is one of those figures who should be more famous than he is, in that it's his interpretation of Magna Carta as the fellow that will have no sovereign that is what we remember today. I'm going to wrap things up there with the shameless self-promotion slide. I'm writing Magna Carta and Its Gifts to Canada, the book that will accompany the Magna Carta exhibition. It'll be published by Dundurn Press next year. I encourage you all to have a look at the articles I've written on the Magna Carta Canada website about Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, and my articles for the Canadian Encyclopedia on Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. And for updates on the book and upcoming publications, be sure to visit my website at royalhistorian.com. So updates regarding my writing and my research will be posted there. Thank you very much for listening.